Hello folks, hope you're having a good day today. Hey, today I want to take a look at H.P. Lovecraft and specifically the many different people that he wrote with and so forth. I'm not going to do a review for you. What I'm basically want to do is put a little bit of a pause into my ongoing Cthulhu and Lovecraft October as I take kind of a deep dive into a number of sort of writers, characters, works, and so forth that are in the Cthulhu mythos as a part of my sort of October. And as you know, I'm already doing probably a number of these and so forth, where I'm doing basically one every other week, and I'm basically taking a deep dive. And before I start going into too many names that you may not be familiar with, I want to take a pause and kind of take a little bit of a slowdown. I believe that the reason why we have heard of H.P. Lovecraft, we know who he is, we read his stuff, he's a part of our canon and so forth, published in classics like Penguin Classics and more. I believe that the reason why he survived is because not of his works themselves, lots of people had great works who aren't remembered by time, but instead because of the people that he wrote with and how those people kept his writings alive and those relationships that he built. And I would argue that the relationships that he built, the letters that he wrote, and so forth, were his primary source of method of writing, his primary method of readership, and so forth. And I would argue was more important to establishing Lovecraft as Lovecraft, and as his popularity of us knowing who he is, the Cthulhu mythos that came about, and so forth. And so what I want to do is take a pause, not do a review, but instead kind of unpack the Lovecraft Circle. I'm going to be using the Lovecraft Circle more liberally than some people do, and that's fine. Basically what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using the Lovecraft Circle for purposes of this video and moving forward to refer to any writer who wrote during the time of Lovecraft with whom Lovecraft corresponded, whether or not that person wrote in the Cthulhu mythos stories. So for example, I would consider Fritz Leiber, who was writing with Lovecraft before and was a friend of his before he wrote and was reviewing some of his writing and so forth that had been rejected prior to Lovecraft dying in 1937, although his first published work wouldn't be until a year or two later. And similarly, I would also consider in the Lovecraft Circle writers that were not in the Cthulhu mythos, like C.L. Moore, Catherine Moore, I would consider her a member, even though she didn't write, stories set in the Cthulhu mythos and so forth. So we're going to take a look at those and so forth. Many of the writers that I would consider a part of that, and so forth. But one of the things that was very great about Lovecraft is that he had a strong eye for style, for sense, for writing, and so forth. He loved reading, loved writing, and so forth. And so if he came across a story in a magazine that he liked, then he'd let you know. He'd write you a letter, and remember, this is before emails and texting and phone calls and so forth. So he would handwrite a letter and send it off to you, and it wouldn't just be a quick little one-page thing that says, "Hey, I hope you're having a good day today. Read your letter." Read read your article or your story in this, in Weird Tales or in Amazing Stories or wherever he read. Right, it was really good. I enjoyed page 10 of that story where you had this happen. I thought that was a really clever idea. Thanks for your time. You have a great day. It wasn't a quick little one paragraph or two paragraph long one-page letter. He wrote many, many pages, and sometimes many of his letters that are recorded are up to 70 or 80 pages long. He was, I would argue, the century's greatest epistolarian. He was the guy who wrote letters, these long letters, these strong letters. He would develop relationships with other writers from afar. And they're very incredibly and very strong ones. And many of it, he would encourage these writers and build relationships with them. And if there was a new writer who came across the scene that Lovecraft liked, he'd reach out to them. If it was somebody he liked their first writing, a couple of things that they wrote, he'd reach out to them, and so forth. Here, I'll give you an example of that. Somebody I'm going to talk about here probably a little bit later. But one just quick example of that is Richard F. Seawright. Richard F. Seawright, and I've actually buried this underneath my thing, so I'll pull it out later on when I start pulling up my books. But Richard F. Seawright wrote a story for Weird Tales about the brain in a jar thing that he actually created, and so forth. He enjoyed the story, reached out to Seawright and said, "Hey, I like your stuff." Richard Seawright hadn't written before, and so forth, and now Richard Seawright is a member of the Lovecraft Circle. He's now corresponding with Lovecraft regularly. He's writing things with Lovecraft. He's writing things now in the Cthulhu mythos and so forth. And now you know who Richard Seawright is because of those letters that Lovecraft started writing out to say, "Hey, you did a good job here. I appreciated it. And I enjoyed your first story. I thought there was a lot of stuff there." And he would do that with a lot of writers and so forth. He would encourage them. He also had this series of stories that he would write, and they were these kind of revisions, and they were, he would do them with Zelia Bishop, Hazel Heald, among many, many others. And you take a look, you're going to see these two bylines here: Adolph de Castro, C.M. Eddy Jr., right, Reggie Barlow, and so forth. And I've actually taken a look at one of these revision stories already for you a few weeks ago, the one with Reggie Barlow, the Night Ocean, which came near the end of Lovecraft's career, and you get these ideas, William Lumley, Adolph, and so forth. And and we'll actually take a look at one or two of these later on. But the thing is that we don't always know to the degree to which he may have co-written them, edited them, ghost writ for them, just took something that they wrote and added a Cthulhu spin to them or something like that, or made it a little darker. An execution, we don't always know the degree to which they were co-written, or he just edited what they wrote, and so forth. In some cases we do, because they were captured in letters. We don't always know, and so forth. And some of them, he actually co-wrote a story, Through the Gates, the Silver Key, with E. Hoffman Price. They met in real life in New Orleans, and so forth. But the Lovecraft Circle was so rich, and there were so many people, and basically he was very much, I would consider him this hospitality of the day from writers. He couldn't bring people into his home, something like that, right? But he was always open, and he was definitely at the forefront of helping writers develop their skills and so forth, and taking them in. But it wasn't always, he didn't usually see himself as a mentor, although there were some cases, I think, Reggie Barlow, I think, would probably clearly be a mentor-apprentice relationship. But it's not like he always saw himself as, I don't think he saw himself as Frank Belknap Long's mentor, based on some of the letters I've read, and so forth. But you get the idea. They were more just equals and so forth, and learn from each other, learn other skills, developing ideas behind the scenes for stories and so forth. And so they were doing these sorts of things. And Lovecraft was, I think, the key linchpin in this. So I'm calling it the Lovecraft Circle rather than the Robert E. Howard Circle or something like that. But he wrote with many, many, many people. So here, let's take a look at a few. And again, these are just a few. August Derleth is a great example. He was a huge writer in both the Cthulhu mythos and, other things that came down the pike. Well, he was one of the people who, with Donald Wandre, who we've already done one of his stories, The Fire Vampires, already. But along with Donald Wandre, he actually founded Arkham House after Lovecraft died in order to keep Lovecraft stuff alive. And I think that's one of the major reasons why we know who Lovecraft is today, because his stuff was kept alive. It wasn't read that much then. The Shadow over Innsmouth was only published with less than 500 books published. Only 150 of them sold, right? It hadn't been sold or popularized at that time. It wasn't until 5 or 6 years after he died that it started to become popular, sold well, and so forth, and people realized this is a great work that was by this lost master, right? And that was because people were still selling his stuff, making his name out there. And so August Derleth was definitely a part of that. Robert Bloch is another person who's a big name out there. He published a lot of big horror stories, horror novels, and so forth for the first 20 or 30 years of horror after Lovecraft died, including Psycho and some other stuff too. He's got a lot of stuff out there too. I just talked about her, but C.L. Moore, Catherine L. Moore, is somebody who he corresponded with quite heavily. In fact, he'll actually introduce her to her husband, Henry Kuttner, who is also another member of the Lovecraft Circle, and so forth. He'll introduce them to each other, and so forth, and basically plays matchmaker with them. It's actually funny because he didn't realize that she was a female writer at first. He thought that C.L. was not Catherine Lee Moore. Anyway, her name's Catherine. And anyway, yeah, but she's actually one of the first female writers during the era. She's incredibly strong. We'll be taking a look at some of her stuff later on. I've actually already recorded one of her first stories for Weird Tales and so forth. She's very good and very well done. But she doesn't write in the Cthulhu mythos or anything like that. But she's somebody who was definitely in the Lovecraft Circle of writers, along with her husband, Henry Kuttner, whom she will meet later on. Obviously, most people know the two big ones, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard. Most people know who these two people are because Robert E. Howard's the writer of Conan. He's the writer of many other things too. Big person. His nickname from H.P. Lovecraft is Two Gun Bob, which is hilarious. They never met in real life, nor did Clark Ashton Smith. And Clark Ashton Smith was the world crafter of the two. He was, of the three, these were kind of considered the triumvirate of Weird Tales. They were the three big ones, the three big names during the time, and so forth, that sold various types, whether it's the adventures and fantasies of Conan and stuff like that, or the various worlds that were being created by Clark Ashton Smith, or the horror, sometimes very cosmic horror of Lovecraft. You also saw, I mentioned earlier, but Fritz Lieber, I consider a member of the cycle too, even though his first story wasn't published until after Lovecraft died. But he had been rejected, he had reached out to Lovecraft and had been developed a strong story, and it was Lovecraft was helping him behind the scenes, build up his craft and so forth, and his first story was published about 18 months after Lovecraft died, and so forth. I'm sure Lovecraft would have lived long enough to see this. The next person I have on my list, I just mentioned, Frank Belknap Long. He was a huge writer during the early. This is probably two of the greatest. You can actually see a picture here on the back of that of the two of them together. But they were probably two of the biggest literary letter writers. I mean, these were some of the letters that are written, that were between them are 80 pages long, handwritten, and so forth. I mean, they're incredibly long, and there's a big number of writers between the two of them, and so forth, and a big respect between each other's skills, and so forth. And Frank Belknap Long may not be a name that you know today, but the guy wrote like dozens of novels, hundreds of short stories, tons of comics, and so forth, and wrote for about 50 to 60 years of his career. He's a giant chameleon in the field. Wrote tons of different things. One of the few writers to actually survive the pulp era and be fine with it, the death knell of it, and so forth. And I just mentioned Donald Wandre. Here's another one who was a big writer during the era of Lovecraft, but then after Lovecraft dies, he basically starts to peter off. He writes about 30 or so short stories, and a few other short stories here and there during his time, and so forth. And he's will turn more towards helping to edit, put together collections and so forth on behalf of Lovecraft, Arkham House, and August Derleth and so forth. And so you will actually be reading another one of his stories. We already did the Fire Vampires earlier, but we'll be doing that here in a little bit. There's also ones out there too. If you do some searching, you're going to come across people like Hugh Cave or Carl Jacobi, who are writing some stuff that are also corresponding with Lovecraft during this era and so forth. Carl Jacobi is a master. He created the genre of adventure fiction that was set in the Southeast Asia. With his stories that were set out there. Actually, I actually really like him a whole lot. I think he's probably one of the better ones that people don't know, but I'm trying to figure out a way to get these stories into my channel so you can get a feel for one or two of them from the pulp eras. I haven't had a chance to do them yet because most of them just aren't set in the three genres that I have. They're just more adventures and stuff. But they're so good. I'm going to take a moment just to pause and let you know. This guy never went to the areas that he was writing about in Borneo and so forth, in Indonesia. He actually just wrote and corresponded heavily with people here, people who are corresponded and were in the field that were working there in various forts and so forth, and he actually wrote that. I also talked about Richard F. Seawright just a moment ago in his Brain in the Jar story. There it is for you. And so forth. He was another one of the folks. And again, there was just so many more people that Lovecraft would reach out to and either say, hey, I think you did a great job, and they would develop a correspondence. Lovecraft cared so much about writing his letters to people that he would skip meals in order to afford the postage so that he could send it to his people. That's how much he cared about the people that he had developed these writing relationships with and the various people. And I think that, again, that's my reason why I believe we are still reading his stuff today, because these people I think they were touched by a master, if that makes sense. And while many of them were equal, I would never consider Clark Ashton Smith or Robert E. Howard or somebody like that to be, his protege, right? Obviously, I think most of these people will see themselves as equals, and I think Lovecraft would do the same. Lovecraft was too humble to see himself as a stronger writer. But still, I think if I were to publish, I published articles for Magic the Gathering, and I've written more than 1,000 articles for Magic the Gathering. Right now, I have a column, 2 weeks, two columns a week over at Cool Stuff Inc. And if I were to have, one of the big game makers, like Garfield, the guy who created my game, or something like that, reach out to me and start to correspond with me, that'd be big, right? Obviously, I consider that a big thing, right? I'm an individual person. I wouldn't see myself as his protege, but I definitely consider that to be a high honor. right, and so forth. And similarly, I think the same thing happened then. Here's a guy, if you publish your first or second short story, and this guy's writing to you and saying, hey, I really enjoyed it, I thought you had some good stuff happening, gives you an 8 or 10 page handwritten letter, that tells you that he actually means it. He's not just giving you like a quick little, hey, thanks, or a courtesy, right? And yeah, you're going to respond, and you're going to develop you're going to become pen pals, right? You're going to develop this long distance relationship via letter. And again, that's why I think this guy was the greatest epistolarian of the century, maybe arguably ever. This guy wrote so many letters and so many things, and he wrote tons more letters than he wrote short stories and fiction and so forth. So I think it's also kind of fun to kind of take a look and unpack where he was. You can unpack a lot of his favorite things and so forth. But again, that's just my key point, that there was this incredibly important Lovecraft circle of writers that were writing during the time of Lovecraft, the pulp era, and so forth, that Lovecraft was in constant communication with, and so forth. And he would constantly bring in more and more and more. And I didn't even go through all of them. I mean, I probably just did maybe 15 for you right there. But there's a lot more too. So again, I just wanted to kind of go over that with you real quick, and now we'll stop this and go back to my review of stories and so forth. But I just want to kind of put that on your plate, and then that way, when we start to talk about a Frank Belknap Long, or a Henry Kuttner or something like that in more detail, you're going to have some of that sort of understanding of who they are. Thanks again for your time.